Oh, very good call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to start off following on from my Green colleague Eugenie Sage with her question around the status of this piece of legislation in terms of the Schedule 4 protection that would normally be accorded to marine reserves under the Marine Reserves Act. It certainly wasn't something that we picked up at Select Committee either. I think it's something that probably should have been raised with the committee, given the numerous pieces of legislation we've had through Parliament around this very sensitive and contentious issue. I suspect the fact that it wasn't raised with the committee answers the question. I suspect that if some kind of level of protection at the level of Schedule 4 was being accorded to these marine reserves, as they would have been under the Marine Reserve Act, we would have been told that, and it would have been trumpeted in every speech from government members. But I would ask that the Associate Minister of Conservation and the Chair to clarify that point. Because if, in fact, we are saying that this is a lesser form of marine protection, then that is deeply concerning. And that's not to take away from what is, on the whole, a good piece of legislation, and a piece of legislation that Labor will be supporting. But if mining activities are allowed to be carried out in the waters surrounding the three islands where these marine reserves are being created, then that is of deep concern, because that's not in the spirit of marine reserve legislation. That's not in the spirit of the policy that has been followed by certainly Labor governments, and purportedly from speeches in the House we've heard on this bill by national governments. And so I would really appreciate the Minister and the Chair, even if it's only a 20-second contribution, to let us know whether or not that's the case, whether or not, in fact, this is a lesser form of marine protection. Our understanding, and the understanding given advice we were told at Select Committee, and I want to acknowledge the work of officials on this, the advice that we were given was that in fact the Marine Reserves Act is very outdated and clunky. It's a very long process. It takes a lot of time, and certainly we don't disagree with that at all. And so this was a way of making sure that we get this protection in place as quickly as possible through a separate legislative process. And we took that on board and thought, well, it does raise the bigger question of what are we going to do about the marine reserve legislation in New Zealand. If our marine reserve legislation is actually preventing the creation of marine reserves in and of itself, then that's a much bigger problem that needs to be addressed, and a debate for a different piece of legislation. But certainly we supported a standalone bill if it meant actually getting some protection afforded to these very ecologically unique and significant World Heritage sites. So I look forward to the Minister's clarification on that particular issue. I want to come back to this issue of shared decision-making power and responsibility between the Minister of Conservation and what was formerly the Minister of Fisheries, but now the Minister for Primary Industries. And this is particularly relevant in this piece of legislation because from clauses 2 on we have, sorry, no, it's not clauses 2 on, it's from clause 8. We have a process within the bill to review whether or not the marine reserve that currently is partially surrounding the Campbell Island should be extended further. And the Select Committee decided that review should occur after 3 years, not 5 years. Submitters who came to the Select Committee were asking for a review after 1 year of marine protection, and we thought 3 years was as a Select Committee, we thought 3 years was a compromise. But the process that is outlined in this piece of legislation is not a process that I'm aware occurs in any other piece of legislation in terms of these decision-making powers, and in particular with relevancy to marine reserves. And what we go through in this process that's been outlined in Clause 8 is what the review must take into account. And of course this is an issue because it's a deep-water crab fishery around Campbell Island, and there were concerns. Obviously government had concerns about the impact on that particular fishery, fishing industry, and so didn't include the part of the marine area around Campbell Island where that activity was taking place. So they have to consider the value of that additional area that's not going to be in protection, the impact of that deep-water crab fishery in that additional area on the marine environment and ecosystems, and the biodiversity values in the additional area that's proposed to be added if that review deems it should be so. The review must include consultation with relevant stakeholders, then the Minister of Conservation must, after receiving that review report, provide the report to the Minister for Primary, Mr Chair. Thank you, for primary industries. It then goes on to say that the ministers must consult each other about the report, which is fine, and then no later than 90 working days after receiving the report, the Minister for Primary Industries must provide to the Minister of Conservation his or her response to the report. Well, that all seemed, very fine and okay, but it does go on to say then that the Minister of Conservation may recommend the making of the Order in Council only with the agreement of the Minister for Primary Industries. So again, we have this decision-making power where a power, and certainly there should absolutely, in terms of marine reserves, be consultation between the Minister of Conservation and the Minister of Primary Industries, absolutely. But again, we have this kind of veto power that we're seeing time and time again, once again undermining the role of the Minister of Conservation. We've seen it in terms of mining on the conservation estate, where the decision to whether or not to grant a dock concession for a mining activity on the conservation estate used to be held solely with the Minister of Conservation. It's now a shared responsibility with the Minister for Energy, and I remember the former Minister of Conservation, Kate Wilkinson, when that was announced, sitting alongside the then Minister of Energy, Jerry Brownlee, trying to convince us that this was an equal relationship and an equal decision-making capacity, and Minister Wilkinson wasn't allowed to say anything, and Minister Brownlee controlled the entire press conference. And here we're seeing it again. Where again we've got the Minister of Primary Industries having this veto power. I don't know what kind of precedent there is for this kind of process that we're putting in this legislation. I don't know who trumps if they can't agree. If the Minister of Conservation says, well, actually, I disagree with the Minister of Primary Industries that this should not go ahead, and the Minister of Primary Industries says, well, actually, I think it should go ahead, so I disagree with the Minister of Conservation that this should be protected. The wording of this bill really worries me because it makes it sound like it's the Minister of Primary Industries that has the final call, because it actually says it cannot go ahead without the agreement of the Minister for Primary Industries. So let's be quite clear that that's who is making the decision about the extension of the marine protected area around Campbell Island. It's not the Minister of Conservation, it's the Minister of Primary Industries. And that's not how it should be, and it's a further undermining of the role of the Minister of Conservation under this particular government. And I think the other issue that we have is also when you put these processes in place, and we're seeing it right throughout environmental legislation, you need a process that really does do away with the kind of natural hierarchy that exists, or bias that exists within governments for one group over another. You want a process that gives everyone fair input, that reflects the relative power of the various groups, and I don't believe that this process meets that test. And certainly with the undermining of the RMA, with the exclusive economic zone legislation, the changes to the Crown Minerals Act, and we could go on and on and on, what we're seeing is an injecting of the government's natural bias for their preferred supporters and preferred submitters actually being put into legislation. And that also is extremely unhelpful and actually undermines public confidence in these processes, which should be there to ensure that that bias is accounted for and does not become part of the decision-making process. To finish on a positive note, I think the Select Committee enjoyed working on this bill. It was nice to have a piece of legislation that wasn't environmentally destructive for once at the Local Government Environment Select Committee. So it was, we enjoyed working on it. I think there is scope for parties across the House to work far more collaboratively and closely on marine protected, working together, thank you, Minister, on marine protected areas, because I think there is some common ground. I take on board the points Eugenie Sage raised about how, well, these are areas that aren't valuable for fishing or mining, and so that's why we've gone ahead. At least we've gone ahead. You know, if we can get common ground at least on those things, then let's do it and let's really ramp this stuff up. And in the areas where there is more contention, well then, we can have votes across the House where we disagree, or where the National Party doesn't want to stop mining or fishing in a certain area. But I think there's a lot of common ground, and there's a lot of areas where we could really make great progress in this area. So I noticed the Minister consulting his officials, and hopefully we have some clarification. That's all we need. So I'm happy to sit down now and happy to support this bill, Mr Chair.
The Honourable Peter Dunn.
Mr Chairman, I'm